This panel that we have today is actually going to be structured around discussing the innovative strategies to fund life science, biomedical technology, and healthcare-related startups. And so we have a phenomenal panel here today to talk about these financing and capital strategies. My name is Kapila Vijjas. I'm the director for Enterprise Works Chicago at the University of Illinois, and that is a 2-year-old operation based at the university designed to help incubate technologies and startups stemming from research coming out of the University of Illinois system, as well as surrounding research institutions, primarily here in the Illinois Medical District. So we're very excited to have been part of the IMD family as a stakeholder and as hopefully a partner to help catalyze some of the research that's happening at the institutions and seeing them come to life in the marketplace. So I wanted to introduce our panel today. As I said, we've got some great heavy hitters, and so I encourage you to take the opportunity at the end of the panel to ask some questions, because it's a very rare opportunity that we have this much talent and experience in front of us in the investment community. I'll start at the end. We have Joe Whalen. He's with Horizon Pharma, and he serves as their Senior Vice President for Business Development and Alliance Management. Joe has over 19 years of experience in the healthcare industry, and he has been leading and supporting transactions in mergers, acquisitions, licensing, co-promotion, and strategic alliances. And so we're lucky that he was able to join us today. Sitting in the middle next to Joe is Mike Liang. Mike is a partner with Baird Ventures, Baird Capital. And he's also a member of several advisory groups that have university-based proof of concept or innovation funds, including the University of Illinois at Chicago, Northwestern's technology transfer office called INVO, and the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. So he has some interesting insight in connecting between the university to the capital markets. And then sitting right next to me is David Donabedian with Abbvie. He is the Vice President and Head of Venture Investments and Early Stage Collaborations. David has been responsible for leading a global team to identify and evaluate investments in early stage technologies, looking at licensing and acquisitions of pre-phase 1 compounds, and expanding sort of the academic partnerships and pipeline for Abbvie. And I think with that introduction, we can demonstrate that we've got a really great panel here. So again, I encourage you to ask some questions at the end of this session. So to start out, I'm just going to give everybody a chance to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about their role, their perspective, and maybe provide a few insights on the investment landscape from their perspectives. So Joe, I'd like to start with you.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for inviting Horizon to participate and for the introduction. I've been at Horizon Pharma for about 5 years. Started at the company, I guess I was employee number 18. We built the company from 5 years to from no products approved to 4 products approved, profitable this year, and 500 employees here today as of in 2014. Horizon, before Horizon, I spent almost 20 years here in the Chicago area at companies Baxter Healthcare for 8 years in business development roles, and before Baxter, I was at Searle Pharmaceuticals, if you remember Searle. Became Pharmacia, and then, like a lot of other companies, became Pfizer. At Horizon, we're focused on bringing drugs to companies, to our patients are in 3 specialty areas: primary care, specialties like our rheumatology focus, and orphan diseases. We have 4 approved products today. Duexis and Vimovo, which are GR-safe or NSAID products. Duexis, which we developed on our own. Vimovo, which we acquired from AstraZeneca late last year. In addition, we are commercializing Rayos, which is a delayed-release prednisone for rheumatoid arthritis. And recently, with the merger with Videra, we're commercializing Actimmune, which is an orphan drug product for chronic granulomatous disease and malignant osteopetrosis. So we're very excited. The merger was announced, I guess, closed a couple days ago. Mm-hmm. We're excited to have the Videra team be part of Horizon at this point. We think they have a great drug, and there's opportunities to develop that drug even further. If you look up in the FDA.gov, you'll see the drug is probably it's being studied or has been studied in about 80 indications. There's a few of those that we're very excited about, in particular developing it for the indication of Friedreich's ataxia and other orphan drugs. I think we look at it as a company as basically a pipeline in a drug and an opportunity to grow further from there. I think for Horizon, our goals are continue to grow the company through product and company acquisitions, like our recent product acquisition from Ovo from AstraZeneca late last year, and a recent merger with Videra. Since, I guess, on financing-wise, I guess since the company was started basically in 2005, I think we've raised almost $1 billion.
That's great. Thank you. Mike?
Good morning, everyone. Unlike Joe, I was probably employee 1900 at my parent company, so I was not involved in the grassroots of it. So I'm with Baird Capital, the direct investment arm of my parent company, Robert W. Baird, a full-service financial shop that's been around for about 90 years, based in the Midwest. He does investment banking, equity research, fixed income, and obviously the direct investment side, of which I'm a part of. So I focused on the early stage and growth stage venture investments, which is probably why I'm here today. And specifically, I focus on healthcare. My group focuses on healthcare as well as technology services. We're probably one of the bigger groups in the Midwest. On the venture side, we probably have about 450 to 500 million under management. And specifically on the life sciences side, I think we're one of the bigger groups. There's a lot of tech things that are happening now in Chicago, which is interesting. I'm sure we'll get in this later on, but I do think it's an interesting time for us in the room here to be looking at life sciences innovation and especially how that ties into the IMD. There's a lot of things going on. I think part of it is from the success that we've seen on the tech scene, being able to replicate some of that success in life sciences community today. We've now, for the first time ever, got mayoral and governor support in terms of pushing forward life sciences initiatives. You got the academics groups that are working better than ever, and Kapila's a big part of that. So thank you for everything that you do. I think we've got a unique time here to build the community from the entrepreneurial side, the academic group, getting the financial institutions together. It's going to take time, so this is not something that's going to be in the press tomorrow, but I think the more and more we can push this forward, and we'll probably get into some funding numbers later on and how we compare relative to the value and stuff, but I just think this is, in the 10 plus years I've been here, this is probably the best chance we have to really build out the healthcare community.
Great, thanks. David?
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me as well. So I'm David Donabie, and I head up the Ventures and Early Stage Collaborations group at Abbvie. I actually joined Abbvie a couple of months after it was spun out from Abbott in March of last year. And I think all of you are probably quite familiar with Abbvie in terms of our focus, our core therapy areas as it relates to immunology, oncology, renal disease, neuroscience, and virology. We have numerous products that are commercially available. We have the world's leading anti-TNF product in Humira. We also have developed products in pancreatic deficiency as well as hypothyroidism, which are also on the market as well. As it relates to our development pipeline, you may have seen recent news as it relates to our oncology pipeline, Volaparib, as well as ABT-199, and a couple of other products that are associated with PARP inhibition as well. And we're presenting those papers for any scientists in the room at the European Medical Society meeting, and I think this next week. So we at Abbvie look at the approach of building our portfolio, both from internal innovation as well as external innovation. So my team is responsible for the external innovation, and similar to what Michael talked about, it is more on the early side. So we are looking for early stage, anywhere from target all the way up to phase 1. We are key to look at opportunities that are aligned to our core therapy areas. We are global in nature, so my team is situated both in the US and in Europe, where we do find a lot of deal flow. We will look for anywhere where innovation is happening. So as it relates to the first part of what we do on the venture side, we are, I would say, a traditional corporate venture investor. So we're looking for more of a strategic fit as opposed to a short-term financial gain. And what I mean by short-term is not an ROI. We're looking really for a return on products. So can we actually make a venture investment, build a relationship with the company, and then have the opportunity to do something much broader, such as a license or an acquisition? And one great case example for us was a deal we had done with Abbvie Pharmaceuticals, which is a biotech located on the West Coast that was developing an enzyme therapy to treat celiac disease. This was back in 2010. And now we're all quite aware of celiac disease and its prominence in our society. And it has been a misdiagnosed, I think, disorder for a long period of time. We made the investment in 2010. In January of 2013, we announced an exclusive option to acquire either the asset or the company upon successful phase 2B data. So we would really like to build those relationships, and that's part of our venture model and our thesis, and we work collectively with other venture groups to do that. So since our inception as a venture group, which was late 2009, we've done 12 investments, both in the US and Europe, one here in the Chicago area as well with a company called Aurasense, which many of you may be familiar with. It's a very interesting technology out of Chad Merkin's lab, nanotechnology, looking at diseases associated with oncology and inflammation, and also investments in Europe. So we'll continue to do that. As it relates to the other part of what our team does is what I call the licensing, early stage licensing and acquisitions. Oftentimes companies are in between financing or they're looking for a broader strategic relationship. And we could provide that through a much harder type of relationship or with more rights associated with the asset as opposed to just a board seat. So we would enter into a license discussion or potentially an acquisition. So our team actually does those types of deals as well. And again, focused on the core areas as it relates to Abbvie's areas of interest. So that's what we do. As it relates to the financing environment, just to let everyone know, so I originally started my career in Boston, in Cambridge, and I started in Harvard with a couple of spin-outs from Harvard Chemistry and MIT, and I still live outside the Boston area. So I commute to Chicago, so I maintain a presence in Cambridge to try and ensure that we continue to see deal flow, but I spend as much time as I can in Chicago. So I think we'll get to more of the ecosystems and environments and maybe some of the differences between, say, Chicago, the West Coast, the East Coast, but also Europe, and maybe some of the lessons learned from some of those other bioclusters or centers that could be translated to the Chicago region or other areas as well.
So why don't we actually take that as our lead and maybe give your perspective on that, sort of the differences, the opportunities that we have and that we see on the coasts internationally and here in Chicago.
So one of the things I can say, again, I'm from the Boston area, is one of the unique aspects of Cambridge, which is actually different than Boston. So it's only separated by about 1.2 miles, but can take you anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour to get from Boston to Cambridge, depending on traffic, probably similar to Chicago, is that it is an epicenter that's only about 5 square miles in radius. So literally in Cambridge, you can walk to most of the academic hospitals, take the T, jump in a cab. It's such a high focused area of innovation. And because of that locale, you really can grab coffee with someone in a 5-minute or 10-minute notice, meet at Starbucks, have a meeting, and then move and go back to your office and then start to work on whatever that opportunity was. The concentration of venture capitalists in the Boston, or I'll call Cambridge area, entrepreneurs, and now what we're seeing as well as a swell of pharmaceutical companies as well. So many of you may have seen a lot of pharma companies that are now putting outposts, and they're actually putting R&D facilities in the greater Boston or Cambridge area. And again, it's accessibility not only to the academics and the science that are coming out of the hospitals, but again, it's this geography which is so different. So I don't know if any of you folks have been to Kendall Square, but literally when you go there, you see new buildings popping up on a daily basis. It's incredible. The amount of real estate that's gone up in the last 5 years has changed tremendously since I've been there as well. The occupancy rate within Cambridge is always greater than 93%. So finding space in Cambridge always comes at a premium, but I think there's a reason for that. It's that locale. It's the geography of things being so close. Even San Francisco doesn't have that. It's much more spread out. You have South San Francisco, you have Mission Bay. It's a very different epicenter than what you've seen before. So I think if there's a way to think of how you can help catalyze or maybe even manipulate some of the learnings of, is there a center within Chicago where you can build around, much like here, and start to see if you can build not only the venture dollar base, but also the entrepreneur base. You know, Chicago has a great wealth of private equity experience, and beyond just biotech and pharma, you folks are leaders in many different aspects, ranging from consumer products to food to other areas. So how do you leverage that know-how? How do you leverage that and really build an entrepreneur base that is able to not only find great opportunities, which I think are here in the Chicago area, but get funding for it. I think that's the real challenge.
Interesting.
Mike,
Mike, from your
let me just
perspective.
add on to
Yeah.
that. I think Dave brought up some good points, and I should just give a quick few seconds on my background and stuff. So I did my undergrad and grad work out at Berkeley and Stanford in the Bay Area. I did a postdoc at Harvard, so spent a lot of time in Boston. Diehard Red Sox fan, by the way, so even though it's a terrible year. And then actually lived in London for a few years and stuff, and that's where I started my venture capital career. So I got a good sense for those centers and the dynamics that David is talking about, and I do think everything he's saying is correct in terms of what you get there. Just to throw some numbers out there, we did some analysis right before this talk, and in the first 2 quarters of this year, and this is all of venture investment, so not just healthcare, but Silicon Valley had $5 billion of venture investment in the first quarter of this year, $7 billion in the second quarter. Now, tech is a little crazy right now, so factor that into the equation. But the Midwest was slightly under $500 million. So that gives you a sense for kind of what's going on. Within healthcare specifically, I only have 2013 numbers, but I think in Silicon Valley it was $2.4 billion spent in 2013. I think on the East Coast it was about 1.9. The Midwest was right around $300 million. This is for venture investment across healthcare. So you get a sense for just the very different dynamic of what we're dealing with. Now, some might look at that as a glass half empty kind of situation. We're dwarfed by what's happening on the coast. I actually view that as an opportunity, right? I first of all think there's a lot of money going into mediocre businesses and companies on the coast because there's such a surplus of capital out there. I think the key for us is to find the right opportunities, the right management teams to back here in the industries that Dave was mentioning. Obviously, with what we have in our power alleys of pharma and biotech, I think what's happening across the med device space, and specifically right now within diagnostics and healthcare IT, I think the Midwest has a very interesting opportunity to kind of take a leading place there. And there's some interesting companies that are now being formed that I'd say early stage or even mid-stage companies at this point that could be very successful. If we have more of those businesses do well and succeed, and that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about trying to support these initiatives, I think those numbers will start skewing in our direction. So that's just some of the numbers I wanted to throw out there.
Great.
Yeah, so I agree with Michael. I think success breeds success, and capital will find successful companies. I think some of the disruption and through mergers, Searle being acquired by Pharmacia created a whole infrastructure. I think in my experience, and I am from Chicago area, so Cubs fan. I think the Cubs were actually really good. The Cubs were really good when they were in the Illinois Medical District. They won 2 World Series, but it was a while ago.
Is there a direct correlation there?
Maybe we should move back here. I think it showed. But I think, so when I started at Searle, it was the first company I worked for. When it was acquired, it was a terrible thing. Everybody was losing their jobs here. But it created a huge network of people who've gone on to work. There's a couple, David T. Meyer, Dan Marcel, are working at tech transfer offices in the area. Tim Walbert, who started Horizon, our chairman and president, came out of Searle. I think these kinds of activities and the successes these executives and teams are having will just generate more funds for the Chicago area.
Great. So to build on that and touch on a topic that's very close to me that I'm working to try and address is that linkage that David talked about building a base of entrepreneurs and the linkage between talent and capital. If David could talk a little bit more about how do we build those linkages between talent and capital, maybe leverage some of that expertise, but in a more entrepreneurial way, if you want to comment on that.
It's a great question, and I wish I had the answer, but I think the point Joe made is a great one, and it sounds corny, but it's really true, right? Success breeds success. But what is success? It's really interesting. You can determine success in how was a drug delivered to a patient, right? In the most cost-effective way. That could be one metric. Or from a venture standpoint, was there a return on investment that made the partners feel that this was a great investment opportunity and the thesis proved itself out? Or you could talk to the LPs and see what they thought of, working with that venture group, and did they feel that the returns over a certain period of time was helpful? So I think success has to be kind of measured. So what's the key metric I think we'd be looking for? I really think is, what are the enabling groups to help support your investment thesis? So beyond the work that Michael is doing here, we're seeing the rise, right? As Michael mentioned, it's a good point of capital, right? The markets were good the last 13 and 14, especially on the IPO market. So a lot of early stage companies in orphan disease and cancer would be able to actually, quote unquote, exit or provide a return on investment for their investors, which will provide a more liquidity to go back into early stage investing. So is there a way to capitalize on those opportunities and bring some of that deal flow or deal capital back to this area? I think part of it maybe too is working, as you said, is finding seasoned entrepreneurs who have been successful, who are willing to be more active in small companies. Beyond just advising, would they be willing to take an SAB seat or a board seat? Really showing that they're behind the company beyond just a conversation with the CEO on a monthly basis. That's another way of showing commitment, because as we've heard, as Michael's mentioned, as we do too, we look at not only the science very critically, but the management team. Right? You want to make sure we talk about a seasoned management team. I would like to work with the management team that has not only worked together, but has experienced some challenges together to see how they'll perform. Because in biotech, as we know, the numbers aren't working on our favor for success. So if you can find those groups who have worked together for years, who have gone through some highs and lows, but who have come out on the high end of those endeavors, those are the types of groups we'd like to invest in.
Great.
Yeah, let me add on that, just because I think it's always interesting in our business. I've talked to so many people who are like, I've got a company I want to run. I can't get backed because I always hear that we don't really want to back a first-time CEO. But then the person's like, well, how do I get that opportunity if I can't be the CEO and then I'm not a first-time CEO anymore? And I never know the answer to that question. So if anyone has the answer to that, please let me know. Yeah. I do think this whole thing about seasoned teams is an interesting one, and I do think that's what builds up the infrastructure just as much as financial dollars and commitment in the community. I do think that's a positive for us and what's happening around here now. I think there's a lot of programs that are dedicated to this. It's great to see what the universities are doing. The University of Illinois and their Proof of Concept Fund. Northwestern is setting up their garage and incubator area. University of Chicago with their Chicago Innovation Exchange. And then you've got programs like SIM, Chicago Innovation Network. You've got the Propel program within iBio. I mean, all of these, and people always say, are these repetitive? Are they redundant? I don't think so. I think there's been a lot of models of places where there's different mentorship programs, incubator programs that help the different clinicians and the entrepreneurs that are out there and help them learn what it takes to build a business, what does it take to be an operating person, this and that. So I'd encourage those of you in the audience who are going down that path to reach out to any of those different groups, iBio, SIM, the universities that you happen to be at. It's great to hear what Rush is doing right now and some of their active discussions in terms of setting up Innovation Fund and what's happening there. They're in active dialogues to get some of that up and running. So I just think there's a lot of opportunity here. You're hearing, and a lot of this is driven by demand. You're seeing a lot of clinicians out there, a lot of people who are like, I've got an interesting thing that I'd like to pursue. Clinicians aren't necessarily trained in that. How do we get this up and running? And now there's more resources and support than ever to help build that up. It'll take time, but we're getting there.
That's great. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the macro level of the landscape, what's happening in the capital markets, and talked about ecosystems. Let's bring it down a little bit more granular and talk about a specific example, and maybe Horizon's example is how they started and rose. And from what I think we understand, Horizon actually started in a Panera Bread.
Well, that's mostly true.
Yeah.
Horizon, I think, like the area here, Horizon actually in 2005 was formed out of the demise of Vioxx. So a physician in California, Dr. Tidmarsh, and the entrepreneur Barry Gallenbeck formed the company in 2005 through a traditional Series A, B, and C rounds. They got the company to a clinical stage and met our current chairman, CEO, and President Tim Walbert at a JP Morgan event. Where they matched up and decided it was a great fit based on his experience at Abbott commercializing Humira, that having Tim commercialize this drug and building a team around it would be a fantastic opportunity for the company. So Tim took the job, wanted to stay in Chicago, had family here, had worked here before, and yes, did meet at Panera Bread for, I think, the first I don't know how long, for quite a while, maybe until Panera Bread threw us out for using the free internet. Yeah. But eventually, I think through the help of the governor's office, Department of Commerce, we were able to secure some, and this was a little bit before my time, but we were able to secure funding and some space at the Illinois Technology Park, the old Searle facility in Skokie, and that was what really kicked off the company here in the Chicago area.
So, following on to that, what were sort of the next stages of capital and of growth for Horizon?
Yeah, so I think and I was thinking to your point, Michael, about all the opportunities there are to help entrepreneurs and get their products approved or ideas into companies. And with Propel, I think they've funded 80 or so projects and $80 million. iBio is doing a great job, and I don't think there can be too many of these. When we were young, I started it in 2010. We had a strategy of fundraising that basically went like this: we like who likes us. So I think you can never have too many people willing to help you or to take it, to take that help from them. But we built the company 2010 when I came on. We merged with a European company, Nitec, that gave us basically two pre-commercial products, two products in development, and a story to do an IPO. So Horizon went out. I guess we did about 8. So when you do an IPO, you file on the S1, which is basically the business case for the company. It took us about 8 of them to get it right. And I think as someone was saying earlier, you do face a lot of adversity and a lot of challenges, and we had significant ones. 2010-11 wasn't the best time to do an IPO. It was pre the Jobs Act, which has made startup IPOs a little bit more streamlined. We would have benefited from that. And we had one of the hurdles we faced is our lead bank got a little bit of cold feet, so we changed banks. I forget if it was between S1 number 3 and S1 number 5, but somewhere along the path, we changed the banks and were able to drive through, raise $50 million in July of 2011. I think 2 days before the European economic crisis. So, wow. So yeah. Made it out, and then I think once you're public, the access to capital is somewhat easier.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you talked about some of the more traditional forms of biotech and healthcare startups getting funding, Series A, Series B, and then sort of cobbling together some banking opportunities. But what are we seeing, and I'll turn it to David, in terms of newer approaches, given that in the life sciences and the healthcare, they're capital intensive, the life cycles are longer. Are we seeing new, different approaches to capital instruments that are coming online?
So I think, as the point mentioned earlier, there was the potential, as we would call the downturn in the economy several years ago, and what that caused was a lot of stress on the system where there was not a lot of available capital from traditional, say, venture sources, because they were unable to potentially provide that capital to the very early stage opportunities, so they start to focus their efforts on more later stage opportunities that were closer to commercialization. And I think that really led to the involvement of corporate venture capital, so groups like Abbvie that then started our group to really step in and provide not only that capital, but also the insights that we have beyond just the dollars we put in. So we have experience obviously developing drugs. We have groups that can help with not only the preclinical activities and provide perspectives, but also support all the way through commercialization. So that was something that you may have seen from, say, 08 to 14, where you've seen now a lot of the large pharma groups have formed what I'll call more traditional venture arms like ourselves and some of our other peers. So that's one way of helping to, I would say, close the gap. And if you look at the returns for some of those investments back in 08, 09, again in the oncology and specifically orphan disease, the returns have been very good to those groups who really stuck with the early stage opportunities. And based on the market dynamics changing in 13 and 14, a lot of those groups now are in a much better position to reinvest that capital into more early stage opportunities. So that was one part of it. I think also what we've seen is the savvy entrepreneurs, either the first time or not, just finding ways of getting things started. We all heard the traditional friends and family Series A, but I was involved with a startup before I left Glaxo with my colleague. We started the company, and basically it was every weekend just working on the idea, trying to get access to the technology out of a university and talking to anyone and everyone we knew, not so much about getting funding, but planting the seed that we were going to launch the company. So it's getting out there sooner, but the larger, or one of the advantages of trying to do that with folks you know, is kind of building almost the temptation that this deal may not be here if you wait too long. So building scarcity in the deal, which is often challenging to do. We were doing it in a difficult time, but we were able to raise some money from friends and family to get this going. And then this is not, as we said, anything new, but go to folks that you've worked with before. If it's a first-time entrepreneur, then you should seek out folks like Michael to see who they think would helpful, who maybe want to provide some support, not only financially, but also through their support. Because what you'll find is investors, again, invest in teams, and if you've surrounded yourself by mentors or people who have been successful, that will then elevate potentially your ability to provide a return or a success, and therefore get more folks engaged. So beyond the NIH, beyond angels, beyond other sources of income, the government, I think a lot of it is you just really have to tap into your networks as much as you can and leverage the people you know. And if they can't provide dollars, see what they're willing to provide.
If I could just add on to that, I do want to give a plug out to what David does on the corporate investing side. I do think this is a very interesting dynamic that's going on in our industry now. I don't have all the numbers. You probably do, David, just in terms of corporate investing is at its highest that it's ever been. And they really did step in at a time when my industry, the venture capital industry, was kind of having some tough goes. Right, the biotech market as of a few years ago was really struggling. There wasn't an IPO market. Venture capitalist groups were struggling to raise capital. And everyone's like, all right, what's going to happen to early stage innovation? And I do think a lot of the corporate groups did step in and come in, Abbvie and everything that's going on. So I do think, to those out there, one of my recommendations is, as you talk to friends and family, angels, depending on what stage your company is, venture capitalists, also keep in mind the corporate groups who are going earlier and looking at opportunities. I think that's just as viable option today as the traditional funding routes. The other thing I would say is just everything that David just mentioned. I mean, especially for us being in the Midwest, we need to be capital efficient. I just showed you the numbers of where capital dollars are. You can't rely on $50 million of capital going into your business and this and that, whatever. Our entrepreneurs are finding ways to do things quicker and on less capital dollars. And I know it's not easy, and they have to wear 6 different hats, whereas most entrepreneurs wear 3, for example. It's a hard proposition, but it's something that we had to do. And one of my favorite stories is one of our molecular diagnostic companies. One of my advisors had helped found a company, and he had leveraged $20 to $30 million of his NIH research grants to get things up and running. But they also had done a lot of work in Canada. And it was very interesting, just the dynamic that's going on in Canada. And they were giving me statistics that for every dollar that they spent on R&D, 70 cents came from the Canadian government. And for an investor like me, I kind of like that equation. So my next thing was I got to find more things in Canada to invest in. But it's just those type of things where people are being very conscientious of the grant dollars they can raise, finding tax credits and things to push things forward further along. And that's going to lead to a lot of investors wanting to come to the table because you haven't raised that much capital, your valuation is not that high, and it's a win-win for everybody involved.
So David talked a little bit about how corporate investment is closing the gap a little bit, and the environment is sort of, people are getting a little scrappier and a little bit more capital efficient. Has that landscape changed the investment profile or the guidelines that a traditional venture firm will be looking at in sourcing early stage deals?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Kapil. I'd say I'd look at it as a tale of two cities. I do think venture capitalists in general are still looking for that big win, the big opportunity, especially, and I'm going to stereotype a little bit. A lot of the coastal groups are like, well, we're not going to invest unless it's a 10x or 15x opportunity. I think our group looks at things a little differently, not to say that we wouldn't do a 10x or a 15x opportunity, but we're trying to be realistic in terms of, hey, in today's market, you look at where the average successful company exits. I think it's always right around 100 to 150 million in value. How do we make a return on that type of exit? And I'm sorry, I don't know how capital efficient you are, but it's hard to make a 10x on a $100 million exit. But our name of the game is, at the end of the day, with our fund and our investments, some of them will go to zero, some of them will do well. Can we make over a 3x return on our fund as a whole? And so we try to target 5 to 6x returns on our companies, understanding some of them won't perform as well. And so that means raise less capital. We understand where exit valuations typically are, and try to get these and potentially even partner with a group like David's company earlier on and saying, hey, listen, we'll cap a little bit of our upside and take a 4x to 5x, but that may be a win for the corporate strategic who has the opportunity to get on that earlier. I think those are the things that you need to do and be creative about. And I think the industry has moved toward that somewhat, like, you know, venture capital funds are now saying, hey, we're raising less dollars, you know, we're looking for the 4x, 5x. But now that the biotech IPO market is hot again and everything that's going on in healthcare IT and everyone sees what's going on with the Facebooks and of the world, there seems to be a bit of exuberance again.
Right.
So we'll see where it all shakes out.
Right. And how do you see some, or I'm sorry, did you want to add to that?
Sure.
Yeah,
So, maybe I'll add. So I think you bring up IT, and that is the IPO market has been great. It's been a boom, but we do compete for dollars with the IT VCs, right? One of Horizon's investors, Scale, basically got out of healthcare investing to focus more on IT. So that's always a challenge is you know, competing for those dollars, and the more successes, again, that we have helps. But I was going to bring, you know, to the point of new methods of raising money. I think one of the most interesting, and I believe it came out of the Jobs Act, is this crowdfunding. I know there's a local company, Healthios, that's trying to lead the charge in this. Excuse me. And I'm not sure how well it'll work for drugs, given the long lead time and big dollars. For med tech, it might be a better option. But where it's actually been tremendously successful is I'm sure you've all seen the Ice Bucket Challenge. So for donations for disease states, especially orphan-type diseases, it's been a huge success.
But can I just, I want to comment with Joe brought up an interesting point. I do think there's a lot of groups that have moved away from healthcare. I mean, this is a healthcare focused crowd, I imagine. And now we're doing tech. And I just think that's very, very short-sighted. Our businesses are very cyclical. I remember in 1998, I talked to investors, and you got a venture capitalist who was an MD, who was an emergency medicine doc, and he would say, well, I'm our .com expert in our fund. I'm like, how are you possibly a .com expert as an MD and stuff? And it's just because they were putting everybody on their .com deals, and that's the way it was, and we saw how that all worked out. Healthcare has certainly been a more challenged environment than tech, but you're already seeing now, and I just had our annual meeting last week talking about this dynamic, how everyone's like, tech's in a bubble, the valuations are crazy, how does Snapchat get $10 billion valuation off zero revenue? I mean, like, it's those type of dynamics, right? And it's just, I guarantee you, in about 3 years, we'll be having this discussion about, like, hey, healthcare markets are fantastic. Healthcare reform has done so much for innovative business models and stuff. So for those out there and saying, hey, tech's great and this and that, whatever, that, I'm not saying it isn't, but there's always going to be a place for healthcare innovation, and I think that's going to stay.
So we've talked a little bit about, we've talked a lot about how the capital is really, a core focus and the enabler really to get products to market. But at the end of the day, we're still trying to get products to market through our industry partners and building out our product portfolio. So Joe, could you talk a little bit more about how does Horizon approach looking for building out that platform or that product portfolio in the landscape that we're talking about? So
I think for us it was initially in 2010 it was about raising money to finish clinical trials, right? So very traditional, and then the IPO was about raising money to commercialize products that were approved. For Horizon now, in I guess our next iteration, it's about continuing to grow. We're probably looking more at on-market products such as Actimmune, which we just acquired. And I think the benefit of Actimmune is not only do you have a product that's on the market, but it's basically a pipeline in the drug, and that you can develop it for other diseases to help to the benefit of other patients. So that's where our focus. I think we have to grow a little bit further before someday maybe we'll have a venture fund and do some earlier clinical stage work. But that's kind of where we're at in our development.
Great. And so from the Abbvie perspective, as Abbvie has kind of grown into its own over the last couple of years and is looking at broader partnerships, we heard a little bit about the Google Alliance on the West Coast. What other kinds of things do you see on the horizon for industry to be able to do creative, innovative things like that maybe we in the Midwest, specifically in the IMD, might be able to enable with industry partnerships?
I think, as it relates to innovative partnerships, it all goes to what's the end goal in the partnership. So, example, as Michael talked about, if there's scarcity of resource or capital, what are the best deal models to help provide the fuel, be it limited, necessary for innovation? So I think kind of thinking through those different models is one way of trying to determine then which one do you focus in on. And again, not to reiterate it, but again, the science drives all these discussions, because regardless of the best deal, if the science isn't good, we won't do the deal, or Michael won't do the deal. Joe won't go out and grab that product even though it's generating X dollars, because we just won't do deals like that as a organization, as a industry. So I really think it has to be driven in the science. So one of the deal models that you may have been seeing coming to rise over the last, I'd say probably 4 or 5 years, is something called the build to buy model. And Michael talked a little bit about this when he inferred about the return on investment and potentially capping upsides for investors. And part of that capping is with a known exit. So oftentimes a large company, a pharma, or it could be in a different industry as well, will work, say, with Michael's group and say, look, we want to start companies with you, but agree to the terms of the buyout of what each company would look like. And these are the types of assets or technologies we would like in there. And we will, provide capital, and perhaps alongside with Michael provide that capital, so it reduces his exposure, that he knows he has a partner that is at the end of the potential time point or wherever it may be to acquire the company. And for the pharma company, it gives them greater access to new medicines, perhaps at a lower cost, or with greater expertise. Because again, if you have a small group focused on one program, they can move maybe much more quickly. So this is something that we've seen a lot, called the build to buy model, that's taken place. And again, it helps augment not only pipelines for, say, a pharma company, but also to help venture groups like Michael, as he said, in terms of kind of metering the home runs versus some of the singles and doubles and some of the other opportunities that may not work well. So that's one thing that you can think about as well. And then working with those groups who have the know-how to set these companies up, either locally or outside the area, and entrepreneurs that want to be invested in those companies. Because it is a different model, because it is potentially capping the upside. So you want to make sure that the entrepreneur or the academic or whoever's involved understands that, but also understand they'll be having a potential win if they're able to produce on the science they put forth.
Great, thanks. So we have actually an audience primarily of some of our Illinois Medical District stakeholders and a lot of folks from research institutions, clinicians. What criteria, guidelines, thoughts would you advise some of these folks who are developing cutting edge, great research, but are really looking to the horizon to take it to the market? What kinds of things would industry, investors be looking for that clinicians and researchers need to be thinking about today as they're developing these products? Joe, you want to?
Well, I like when you keep using the horizon in your.
Oh, yeah.
So I think. I think it's been said a couple of times. I think take advantage of the resources that the area is building. And in addition to this park, I know the governor and the mayor are putting together an incubator, Matter, I think it's called, and that's going to become up and running. So take advantage of those resources. Take advantage of all these mentor programs, Chicago Innovation Mentors, Propel, because I think you'll get good coaching and advice, and you might get some. So we have people at Horizon that are volunteering time there, and you're getting people who are volunteering for these groups that have been part of startups in Chicago area and have been successful and may be the next person looking for the next CEO role or some management role to build these next companies.
Mm-hmm. I would answer this question but maybe in two ways. I do think when we see a lot of opportunities that a clinician or early stage entrepreneur presents, it usually falls away from a number of two things. Number one, in terms of the team itself or the stage of the opportunity, right? So let's just address each of those. I think for clinicians out there, figure out what your role is going to be in the business, right? And the question we always ask is, do you want to be part of this company? Are you going to be leaving your clinician day job to be running this, or is it you want to hand this off to a team so you can be the scientific advisor, founder, but leave it off to more capable business people? If it's the latter, then go find those people that can help you pull together the business plan, the opportunity, the financial model, and this and that. If it's the former, then go work with some of these different type of mentorships program to see exactly what it takes to be a startup entrepreneur. On the capital side, we see a lot of things that are early. Even in what David sees, I'm sure a lot of the things he's like, this is very interesting, it's up our core alley, but it's just early, right? I think that's where a lot of these things that the institutions and different universities are putting to play are really help. And people have talked about this funding gap that's always there, and it's still there. But whatever you can do, rely on leverage research dollars, some of maybe the proof of concept funding that are at your institutions to help push this further along, get that one more animal study done or some benchtop data or prototypes made the further along it can go, the more likely it'll get funded. Because I think most of the time, I may be wrong on this, but most of the time things get turned down because they're too early. You think that's probably true?
I think that's really a good point. And to Michael's point, he summed it up. Don't be afraid to do the killer experiment too early. And it's hard to do that sometimes but also it helps you in the long run, because you don't want to start something where you knew there's some data that you should have that would really be the make or break, because that's the experiments Michael's going to ask for and I'll ask for as well. And if you don't have that, to his point, we'll be less inclined to fund that opportunity versus other opportunities we see where they have that data. So I think, be true to yourself, be true to the science. And I think everything you heard here is go get information first. It's very glamorous to say you're an entrepreneur and you're going to be a CEO and start your company, but there's a lot of hard work that goes into this. And maybe Joe didn't talk to you about some of the work that had to go on before his company even started, but most entrepreneurs don't launch their companies for 18 to 24 months because they're trying to negotiate the points they need to take it to Michael or myself, and oftentimes they're doing that without salary. So you really got to see if you're truly dedicated and want to try that. It doesn't happen to everyone, but that's what usually does happen. So you've really got to get that information and just see if that's the phenotype you are. Do you like to do that? Because there's a great chance that you may have checked all the boxes and Michael says it looks great, I say it looks great, but it's just not the right time. Mm-hmm. So you just have to be prepared for that. So, in the room, maybe some of the advice is and if you're not that person, that's fine, but you could surround people like Michael just said, that can help you do that. So you may not need to be the CEO. You could be the scientific guiding light behind the organization, or you could have an operational role if you really like the operations part. So don't think that you have to be the CEO. Just make sure you understand what you want out of your idea.
Right. I think that's some great insight. I want to spend a few minutes to turn it over to the audience. We, like I said, have a great opportunity to tap their minds. And so if we have any questions coming up, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very interesting panel. And we just heard about Abbvie, having a very dominant business position, but maybe moving forward they're going to be kind of virtualized. And thinking about those drugs, like in the melanoma space, drugs that actually recruit the immune system to eliminate the tumor, and they're very, very exciting compounds having big effects in the clinic. And they're being marketed at a cost of, $150,000 per course. And you're now talking about combinations of $150,000 plus $150,000 per course. The cost of some of these drugs, as we start thinking about moving into population health, is kind of a challenge, especially since the United States may be the last market where those kinds of margins are still possible. As you start thinking about non-communicable diseases in the next decade and stuff like that, and the cost profile of managing health in populations, how do you approach that challenge, thinking about business models and as we deal with the realities of cost and the aging of our populations?
This is a great question for David or Joe.
I was just going to say.
I thought you were stepping up to answer that.
We'll start with Joe and then bring it over to
Abbvie. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot in that question. I think, I think for us as Horizon, we I think just became profitable this year on a non-GAAP basis, I guess. So mostly we were concerned about getting paid and making payroll for quite some time. So I don't think we've had time to address many of the challenges that you pose. But I think one thing that we do is we do have a $0 copay for our patients. So we try to make the medicine as affordable as possible for the patients so that they get the medicines that their doctors are writing. And that's one of the things we're doing here. I think, as far as the cost in general, it does take a lot to get a drug approved. And people like Michael, the investors that he brings into companies are looking for returns on that investment. So to come up with the next innovations, I think you gotta spend money, and it takes some money.
David, how does Abbvie approach that costing
So I just
issue?
think to build on and just it's not only the pharma industry, but it's the healthcare industry as well. So I think it's always easy to point to one part, but let's look more broadly. There's efficiencies to be had throughout the entire paradigm of how we not only discover and develop drugs, but also how we administer them to patients as well. So I think we have to look at the full gamut. And as it relates to, I think how drugs get approved, I think there's some work to be done there as well. So orphan diseases, I think, provide a great potential benchmark of how targeting specific populations, because of the inherent nature of it being rare, allows organizations to be much more efficient in trying to conduct trials on those patients where they think they'll see a benefit, right? So the screening capabilities associated with identifying, say, a monogenetic disease, versus when you're taking very broad populations where the phenotype of the disease may present one way, but actually the genetic underlying causes are still to be known. So I think you have to kind of get in sync with what we can learn from rare disease as well, and really targeting the patient populations that would have the most benefit from those drugs, and then working with regulators as well on designing trials which may require less participants and therefore less time potentially, and also less cost, which could then be something that could be distributed to the final end product. And again, that's just one component, and you know probably better than I do how much the drug cost equates to the overall cost of developing and delivering healthcare to patients. So I think we all have a role in this, and I think we can leverage what we've learned with other diseases, but we do need to have open discussions with everyone who's involved in providing healthcare to patients.
Yeah, that's a great.
I will opine. I
Yes.
was mainly just teasing just because I don't invest in the therapeutic side, but I think your question was a healthcare question as opposed to just a drug question. I think we have publicly stated that in the healthcare space, I do a lot of more of the devices, diagnostics, tools, healthcare IT stuff. We just won't invest in a company now that may absolutely have a superior efficacy product, but costs 2x from what the current standard of care is. We just don't think it works in today's systems. The hospital providers out there will certainly be nodding their heads in terms of they just can't afford that today. It's one of the reasons that I actually like the diagnostic space, because companies that can have a clear clinical utility and economic benefit argument, and a lot of these diagnostic tests are done in such a way that can help prevent unnecessary medical procedures that are bad for the patients as well as the hospital system. I just think that ties in well with where we are today in the healthcare, and everything that you just mentioned. So for this is the other part that we ask a lot of our companies. Not only do they have to wear 6 hats and they have to do it on less capital, they've got to build something that's faster and cheaper, and it doesn't cost as much as what's currently being provided. I mean, it's a high hurdle, but I just think that's where we are today in healthcare.
Great. How about one last question from the audience? Anything? Yeah, Arun.
So Arun Bhatia here from Illinois Ventures. Many of you know us that sort of the venture arm of the University of Illinois. David mentioned something early on about the concentration of entrepreneurs in pharma and biotech, say out in Boston, as opposed to here. As we look at some of the very early stage technologies coming out of this community as a whole, and I also came out of Baxter too, so sort of seeing both sides of the table. I think one of the biggest challenges for these companies is early on getting a viewpoint of what the pharma customer wants to see at the end of the day. I was sitting in a meeting yesterday where a company said, I need to raise $200,000 to do this phase 1 study. And I said, well, what does pharma want to see? They just want to see phase 1 data. Well, what does that mean? So I'm getting to a point of increasing some of those conversations between industry and companies to say, here's what we would be looking for, so that I, as a company, am well positioned to come to David and say, here's my data. Now, assess whether you think it's good or not. But I think there's such a gap right now in terms of even understanding from a company perspective of what it is that end customer wants to see. And so a broader question would be sort of, are there sort of mechanisms? We've talked about SIM, we've talked about Matter. Are there other mechanisms that you've seen out on the coast where those collaborations happen better or more efficiently? Because I think that, in some of the things that I've seen, is the number one challenge for some of these early stage companies.
It's interesting you say that, because I will get calls not from the academics or the entrepreneurs, but from our fellow VC friends who want to understand what we're looking for. So they're taking on that diligence, right, to figure out what the killer experiments are. Again, what's the data that a potential buyer will look at to say, this is something that we feel there's proof of concept. And just as you said, it could be phase 1, it could be preclinical proof of concept, we don't know. But they're polling various groups, not just our group, but other groups. And that gets into this whole 18 months to launch a company, right? Because what you don't see behind the scenes is the venture groups seeding these companies and really developing a very robust business plan and working on that, not competitive landscape, but understanding what, as you said, the buyer is looking for. So I think it may be, to answer your question, it's just the level of sophistication that you just don't want one input, but it's part of your business plan development. So when you do go pitch to Michael or myself, you've done your homework, right? So I think you have to just have that outreach. And if the venture groups here are able to provide that, that's great. But if not, the academics or the entrepreneurs would have to try and get that input from a source that's credible. So Joe's sitting here, he's mentioned 3 or 4 prolific people that are associated with his company that probably know a lot about drug development and commercialization, right? That's just one source from this meeting where you could reach out to and say, hey, could I get 20 minutes of your time to talk about this? But again, what's in it for them as well? Kind of think of the ask and what you're helping them with. And if you position it appropriately, maybe they'd want to take a role in the company as well. And
let me just add on to that. I mean, Arun, you mentioned Matter, but this is exactly why Matter was set up, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with Matter, just look it up and just, it is the healthcare, and I don't want to use the word incubator because it's not an incubator, but it's, for lack of a better word, a business development accelerator to do exactly what you're talking about, right? Can there be, it's not a funding mechanism, but it's a forum by which big pharma, big med tech companies, big diagnostic business and healthcare IT businesses can interact with entrepreneurs, the universities, and investors in a forum to ask and answer a lot of those questions. Hey, what's that killer experiment do I need to do? A phase 1A study, how do I do it? What type of controls do I need to do? And so a lot of the big companies have said, hey, we're going to bring our research people into it. Some people are saying, hey, we're going to bring our business development people into it, because people are looking for different questions, right? I think from us as an investor perspective, we'd be very interested because we have those same exact questions. I want to know from a company like, okay, I think this is important, but I eventually need to invest in the business and sell it to someone like Abbott or Abbvie. I want to know if we're thinking about these things the right way and stuff. So Matter was set up exactly to do these type of things. So I would encourage each of you to look into this for those of you who are kind of having that same type of question.
All right, so I think we're getting the nod that we need to wrap this up, and I just wanted to thank Joe, Michael, and David for spending the time with us, sharing their insights. I hope it was informative for you all, get you thinking a little bit more about the opportunities we have here in Chicago and the Midwest, and some of the things we need to think to plan for the future. So thank you to the Illinois Medical District, Warren and Heather and John and the entire team, and Jennifer for making this possible. I think it's a great platform for us to have these conversations and continue to grow the opportunities here in Chicago and the Medical District. So thank you to you all. Thank you for your time.